Hey, Alvin.
Hey there, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. Did you have a chance to work with John's files?
No.
Okay, okay. I did. I, I compared them, so we shall see what the Kingmaker has to say about him. I see he's online. The
Kingmaker, huh?
Kingmaker. That's he made the file, so it was. Eh, I'll say it when it's time, but I had to figure out how to do it to compare them. But anyway, I did it. So I have some comments. Is it raining in Framingham? I'm not Framingham, in Groton, where you are?
It's sunny right now. It rained early in the afternoon.
Yeah, I had a recording that I went to that got rained out. It was outdoors. So they said they're going to wait till it stops raining. And I said, okay, I can't do that. That was around 1 o'clock. So
Do we want to discuss those recordings before we start the meeting?
I don't know how. No, I think we better wait on John. He's on board.
Okay.
But my guess is he'll guide us into the discussion. That would be my guess, Tom.
Yeah, that was a very good comparison.
Yeah, it was easy, wasn't it?
Oh, no problem.
No problem whatsoever. But both sounded very good too.
They sounded very good for different reasons.
Okay, that's a nice qualifier, and I can go along with that. Yeah, it sounded very good for very different reasons. We better hold up those reasons until.
Yep.
Did you write them down or just memorize the differences?
I just memorized the differences were the same for both. But I'll wait till he gets on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We'll wait till he gets on.
I see you have a jacket on. Is it cool up there?
It is. It's in the low 70s, but my basement, which is my manhole, how I find everything else, is always lags behind the weather outdoors. So it's usually cool down here up until about middle of summer.
How's everybody doing out in audio land?
Good.
Audio's been good, but I've had a string of weird problems, car batteries, AC problems, you name it, all in a period of about 3 weeks.
AC, you have a new AC because you have a new house.
Yeah, there's a control board on the heat pumps. So in the wintertime, when you have it reversed, it actually turns off the fan for a little while to defrost the coil. And that board is intermittent. So I just bypassed it so it works like a regular air conditioner. And we've got a new board on order. And my wife's car battery died, which was strange. I have never seen a battery short.
Ooh.
I tried to charge it and it was like a dead short. So we replaced the battery, and I had one of the elements in the hot water heater go out. You name it, everything happened in a couple of weeks.
Just be thankful your battery in your car didn't short out directly like I had my stepson's car did that. And the whole engine got trashed because the car got trashed because the battery set the engine area on fire.
Yeah, that's a real problem.
Yeah.
I had a car once that the solenoid on the starter got stuck on, and I released the start position on the key, and the starter kept running, and I said, "Ooh, this is a problem." And as fast as I could, I ran downstairs and got a socket wrench and took the lead off the battery.
Yeah.
And by that point, the starter was just beginning to smoke.
Ooh.
My wife said it sounded like a herd of horses running up and down the basement stairs getting a wrench.
Good analogy.
When you got to move, you got to move.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the bad thing was the car was in the garage, and I had just gassed it up the night before because we were going up to Madison for a PSAX meeting.
Yeah.
So I had a full tank of gas. I didn't want the car to catch on fire.
Yeah, that would have been fun. Okay, I got 5 o'clock.
Yep.
Mhm.
We may as well start the meeting. We start with open forum. Anybody want to start off?
We had an interesting meeting a couple of weeks ago at my house. A few of the guys from the New Jersey Audio Society had heard the system, and they thought it was worth having a meeting. So the New Jersey Audio Society trundled on down from New Jersey and had the meeting here. And at the meeting, I did a small presentation on the philosophy behind my speakers and room treatments. And also, we had a presentation by Rich Hollis on DSP in general and the Danville unit that I'm using. So altogether, it was a pretty good meeting.
How many people?
20.
And from New Jersey?
Yeah, 20 people drove down from New Jersey. Yeah.
Wow. So there were no local members invited?
No, not for this one. I've had local members on other meetings. This was all New Jersey Audio Society. And
Wow.
their newsletter for June will be out in about a week, and they'll have a write-up on the meeting.
I'd love to see that if you can remember to send
Yeah,
me
I'll send you a note when it comes out.
when it comes out. That'd be interesting. Overall, quick impressions.
The thing that's interesting with the way the system is set up now, I think more than anything else, it allows me to play older recordings that weren't super good that I had trouble listening to now, and they are not great recordings, but now they're very listenable. There's a lower distortion, more of what I call texture, where the individual instruments and voices and everything separate out. And there were a couple of interesting things there. There was a lady who came down who's not really involved in the audio hardware, but listens a lot, goes to a lot of live recordings. And she was listening and she said, "This is the first time I've heard a system reproduce music that made it sound like what I'm used to when I'm there." And there were a couple of other people that talked about how tight and how clean the bass was and the sense of space. But that's what you would expect from any good setup. You know, it's not unique just to this.
Okay, look, Joel Goldberg is upside down. But, well, I'm impressed, and I eventually I'll get to hear it also. So I'm
Yeah,
really,
the room rates at the Parazella Airbnb are really good, Al.
I hear you. I hear it because your development and my development about what sounds good is about the same, and we don't argue about quality.
No,
So
and there's lots of ways to get it. There's not just one way.
that's true. That's true. In fact, you were involved. I noticed with the multiple emails between you and Florida about the whole issue of the room and how much room does and does not contribute, how high the ceiling should be, and et cetera. And have you concluded if you have a bad room, you can never listen to good sound? Or what's what's you and Eric's and what's the other gentleman's name conclusion on that?
Well, my conclusion is that a bad room can hurt the sound of a good system. A good room can't make a bad system sound good, but it can certainly not get in the way of a good system. And there's lots of factors involved. Again, there's not just one good room. One of the best things you can do in a listening room is have a big listening room. But if you can't have a 50 by 30 by 15 foot high listening room, then you most likely will have to do some kind of room treatments either after the fact, or a lot of rooms that I've heard that sounded good, people had a lot of cabinet storage that's open with records and things in there that gave a lot of diffraction. So again, there's no one way to do it.
Yeah, well, the 15-foot ceiling sounds impossible, but Leslie Wins suggests that anything above 11 is gravy. In other words, you want 11, but of course for ceiling height, but of course you accept what's less.
Yeah, when we were building the house, I tried to get that past my wife, but it didn't fly.
Didn't fly. Okay.
No, not at all.
So how high is your ceiling?
That's 9 feet.
9 feet.
It's 9 feet by 16 by 20. Pretty much in the middle of a lot of rooms.
Even that 9 feet is, I think the average is 8 feet because of two wall boards are each fourth.
Yeah.
The average is 7'9".
Well,
Yeah.
most of the rooms on the first floor here are either 9 feet or 12 feet, and we have in the master it's 14 feet. But I would say the majority of the rooms are either 9 or 12 feet on the first floor. We have 2 guest bedrooms on the second floor, and because of the roof, those are 8-foot ceilings.
What part of the country are you in?
I'm about 20 miles north of Philadelphia.
So you still have to heat that volume.
Yeah, but I've got 2 heat pumps, and the nice thing about having heat pumps with the local electric company is from the beginning of October till the end of May, they give you a special rate on the distribution part of your bill if you have a heat pump. Even if your supplemental heat is gas or whatever, mine happens to be electric, but they do give you a special rate on that. So that helps.
How low will your heat pumps go down to temperature wise?
Without supplemental heat,
Without supplemental heat.
realistically about 35 degrees.
Oh, 35, because I understand they can go down to 0.
Yeah, it's a function of how you want to run the heat pump. Some of the newer heat pumps, it's a function of the capacity of the heat pump versus how much heat you're losing through the house, the walls and the windows and doors. And if you have a very high capacity heat pump, and a lot of the new ones are variable speed and on the compressor and the fan, they will run to their full capacity when it gets low. And yeah, I've seen them where they will go down to 0 degrees. But I looked at some of those and I talked to the HVAC guy, and he was just in the process of replacing the main control board on one of those very sophisticated high efficiency units. And he said the price of the board was $3,000. So I decided I could afford a little bit less efficiency.
You could probably program a $500 laptop with the same algorithm.
Yeah, yeah, I probably could.
But my experience with heat pumps in friends' houses is the rate of increase of temperature is really slow because it's not like a hot air system that comes on at 90 degrees. The heat pump is just a few degrees above ambient.
My heat pump, if the temperature is, let's say, in the 45 to 50 degree range, I've measured the heat coming out of the registers, is about 85 degrees. But you're right. That's not like if my old house that had gas-fired heat, I was getting around 110 degrees, right at the register. So it does take longer, but the thing that's good about a heat pump, if you don't have to have that rapid rise, the temperature is more consistent, which makes it more comfortable. It doesn't go up and down as much as like a gas furnace.
Do you keep it running when you're not home?
I keep it running in the winter time if I'm not home, but I drop the temperature down in all the rooms to about 55 degrees. I don't want to get too cold because, the wood will dry out and shrink. But I'm using these Ecobee thermostats. So about 5 hours before I get home, I go to my phone and I turn the heat on. And when I get home, it's fine. And I also have a lot of programming done on those thermostats. If you're using a heat pump and you don't want to use supplemental heat, for example, what I do when I have a setback at night, I start at about 4 in the morning and I start going up about 1 degree every 30, 45 minutes. And that allows time for the heat pump to catch up without turning on a supplemental.
Is this hot air or hydronic?
Hot air. Yeah.
And that doesn't bother you while you're sleeping?
No. It's pretty quiet. It's pretty quiet. The fans, the ducts, it's a new house, it was built with bigger ducts, and Therefore, the velocity through the ducts can be
No.
lower to get the same amount of air.
Good point.
Yeah.
Okay. Dave Murray, I understand the newsletter is about ready.
It's out.
Okay.
I don't know if you've gotten yours, but yeah, I finished it last week and had Hajinlian mailed it a couple days ago. And the fun part for you, Alvin, and John F. Allen and David Hadaway is that off the top of my head, I wrote a few pages of BAS history contributions. Then after one draft, I saw that I'd mentioned John F. Allen 30 times and Alvin Foster 33 times. And so I went back and cut most of those. But anyway, it's got and I didn't go to the pages on our wonderful website and actually crawl through and do a thorough history. This was off the top of my head, but I did run it by enough people that I don't think there are too many gross omissions or gross misrepresentations. But if there are, and assuming there are some, I hope we get letters that we can run the next issue. Brad Meyer already said he was going to write up something. He's mentioned 150 times as well. But it starts from, the early 70s up to the present. But I wrote it quickly. You'll see it needs work, and I'm not going to do any more work on it. So it's all up to the letter writers.
David, did you get my manuscript for the next issue?
Yes, I did.
All right, thank you.
Anybody else?
I've got a bit of nostalgia. I was in a used record store in Brookline the other day, and they've got a couple of pieces of old equipment hanging around. And that included a pair of Dynaco 825 speakers, which are my first introduction to hi-fi. The first real good sounding speakers I ever heard. I was a junior in college, so that was a little over 50 years ago.
So the 850 that came out after the 25s.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Because I had a pair of 25s too, which again sounded very good. But they were replaced, of course, by I think I replaced it with AR6. No, not the 6, AR. The one with the 12-inch woofer, the 8-inch woofer instead of the 12-inch woofer. That didn't help much. I think it was AR6.
The AR6 has an 8-inch. The AR5 was the small version of the 3A.
AR5, that's it.
Yeah.
You got it, Dave. It was
That was not a big seller, and Roy Allison never understood why, because it was the best bargain, and it had the same mid and tweeter as the 3A,
that's right.
and was smaller and more acceptable than the big 3A,
Right.
and an 8-inch, good 8-inch woofer, but it did not sell at all. Several people in my family had, this is again going back 45 or 50 years, owned AR5s, but the 6 is just a two-way with an 8 and a tweeter, and I've got a pair of 6 walnut cabinets that I stuffed with Allison parts and turned it into an Allison two-way, and it's my desktop system. And desktop systems have a big hump at 125 because of the desk, but it's easy to EQ. It's easy to fix, and it sounds very nice. So
yeah. I was impressed by my AR5s.
Yeah.
I knew they didn't do the bass, but the rest was great.
Yeah.
I have news, quick news. Can you hear me?
Yep.
This Wednesday is the final day of You Do It Electronics. It's practically empty right now, but it's going away after 3 generations and about post-World War II startup. So there were some deals, including furniture and stuff like that, but it's practically empty at the moment.
Wow.
Does anybody want to pay a final visit and say goodbye if you know anybody over there? Sometime before Wednesday at the very latest, from what I was told.
Were they losing customers, or is it a family decision?
Well, that must have been part of it, because there's only one of the old guys left, and his daughter, I think, was also working there. And basically, the COVID did them in to some degree, because they used to have things like little radios and hi-fi department and TVs on the second floor, and they basically closed that down. So everything was on the first floor, and they just, and the internet must have also helped a lot, because you can buy anything you want on the internet now. Or so I never asked for any historical reasons, but I'll probably go back on Tuesday or Wednesday, and I'll see if I can find out a little bit more information, just because it would be interesting. But it is definitely the end of, I won't say a generation, because it's a 3-generation thing going on. But I thought you guys would be interested.
Well, that land became very valuable. You know what's going to happen to it?
That's a good question.
Mhm.
If it's not a great place for housing, because it's basically all by itself in the corner of Industrial Park, overlooking the intersection of 128 and Highland Avenue. And I don't know if they're going to the building is usable, of course. The building's in great condition, but it may be a little bit, and a lot of the other buildings in the area are pretty much the same size, even if like Staples and the auto rental. So I don't think anybody's looking to make a killing, but I assume that with or without the building, the land has got to be worth something, but it would only be industrial, in my opinion.
Yeah, the location is a little weird to get to. If you get off 128 and swing down to get to it, you've got to cross over the very busy road and then wind your way back down through the industrial area to get to it.
It doesn't, actually, it's only about 30 seconds off of Highland Avenue, and no matter how you're coming.
Has biotech expanded to 128 yet?
Oh, sure.
I think it's not a favorite area for them, between Cambridge and, Kendall Square and MIT area. And there are a few spots out towards Cambridge, like Fresh Pond area and Concord Ave because I know at least one guy who's got a company out there. But I think the big biotech operations are in Cambridge, really, right now.
Yeah.
The research labs are in Cambridge. A lot of the production is further out, Waltham.
Yeah, there's stuff along 128
area.
So,
Yeah.
I went to UDoIT last week at, I don't remember the hour. It was 5 something, and it was closed, and no signs of life.
Well, they may have, their hours are more limited, and they weren't open last weekend. I think they opened at 10, and it's just going to be the last 3 days or so coming up, according to what they told me. And before, if you go back a few weeks, they weren't willing to admit anything except that the place was just getting empty. Then I got hints about when it was going to happen, and they'd give everybody notice, and then it happened a lot quicker than it sounded, and they really didn't give anybody notice. So I was in there last.
So they didn't hire an independent auction house. They're just
There's nothing to auction.
Oh.
They get rid of everything. They're including shelves and desks and display cases and ancient tube testers. And in case anybody wants an antique tube tester, there's one store type with about 70 sockets, and there's a couple of real old ones, wooden cases and stuff like that. But a guy I work with has already got his collection, and at least 2 or 3 of them we use at IET for testing tubes before we put them into the strobes and megometers and things like that.
Tell your wife you're going to put it in the front hall just as a decorative.
Oh, which thing? I did get which decorator? I got about 30 strobes that I inherited.
There you go.
Yeah, that's some of them are weird too, but
Yeah.
a lot of
Honey, come
general.
look at this.
How do you enjoy sleeping in the bathtub, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
That's somebody else's line, isn't it? I don't know. Me? No, there's plenty of room.
Anybody
Yeah,
else?
Tom was reminding me of when my neighbors, we built our house about a year before my neighbor next door built one, and they messed up when they dug the cellar hole, and he has 16-foot high ceilings in his basement.
Huh?
Yeah, they went down more than 10 feet, and then realized, oh man, this is on an incline because he's got it's kind of a sloped surface. And they, for some reason, they went down too far and then realized, well, gosh, I guess we're going to just have to build the foundation up, which is, they do it in 4-foot increments. So it went up to 16 feet. I nearly said, gee, would you like to move into ours and I'll move over there? But again, I would have wound up in the bathtub.
He must have paid an awful lot for the concrete.
More than likely, yeah.
And the other problem is the deeper you go, the thicker the walls have got to be. So it's not only the height, but the width. I mean,
plus water.
Yeah, plus water.
Yeah, it's been a challenge, I suspect, although it's a walkout basement, but the house is, I think what they did was they actually built the walls above ground to an extent. And as far as I know, when I looked at it when they were building it, I'm like, oh man, this is what I wish I could have gotten. Instead, what they did here was they put some 2x12s on top of the standard, I guess it's 8-foot construction for basements. So I got up to around 11, 12 feet, and that was it.
Yeah, and then
blessings.
Around here, the footings have to be, I think, at least 6 feet down to get below the ice.
Yeah, get below the frost lines.
Yeah.
Although that's changing now too.
Yeah, my snowplow bill has been going down every year for 10 years.
Mm. Yeah, just make sure your flood insurance is paid up.
Anybody else?
Just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Rich Hollis, if you can hear me.
Yes.
I'm the guy that Tom was talking about last week with the DSP crossovers he's got in his system.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you guys too.
Oh,
Been a member for a long time.
Yeah, if you have any questions about the Danville stuff, Rich is the guy to talk to.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Alvin Foster. We talked over the phone or text message or something. So, but I'll stay in touch. Yeah.
Well, it's probably time to move on to the main topic of our meeting. It's always a pleasure to introduce John F. Allen. He's been a BAS member for a long time, an inventor, an engineer, and somewhat of a musician, I venture. He's here to talk about some recordings that he's done privately, as far as I can tell, for Ben Zander's orchestra at Boston Symphony. And he has a more unique and simpler, I think, take on how to do recordings right. So without further ado, John F. Allen.
Thank you. Some things I'd like to say before I go into the recording part of it. I'm not someone who's a big fan of loudspeakers or their sound. There are people, and I have met them and I've had them here, that like the sound of loudspeakers. My ears have spent more time in front of live symphony orchestras than a lot of recording engineers, a lot of sound engineers, particularly at Symphony Hall, which is, of course, one of the best halls in the world. And so my ears have been calibrated to a very, very high standard, if you will. And that has guided me in everything that I've done, whether it's been a sound director for the Boston Ballet or sound systems for movie theaters. I want things to sound real. I don't want them to sound amplified. I don't want them to sound processed. I don't want them to sound like they're coming out of speakers at all. And At the ballet, for instance, no one knew that the sound system was on. And yet, if you shut it off, they would have known something happened. But it was so accurate and so natural, no one was really aware of it, including music critics. So it can be done. Sound recording, sound amplification, reproduction can be done to a very, very high accuracy. And accuracy is all I care about. I don't care about sound effects, multi-miking and all that kind of stuff. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the concert experience. And I know that there are people that are not like that. I had a very interesting conversation with Steve Oades a few weeks ago, and he said he doesn't want to hear the hall at all. That shocked me, as Steve will remember. He's interested in listening to music in a different way when he's listening to speakers than I am. And that's perfectly valid. But it's just interesting. And I just wanted to say what my preference is.
Are electronics used in Symphony Hall?
Say again?
Is electronic supplement to the sound used for the symphony orchestra or the pops?
Absolutely not. Well, pops is different.
Yeah.
Pops is different. There could be a quartet or something there, and they may bring something in. And of course, if there's a singer, they may amplify them.
Because I did see a sound control board.
Yeah,
when I was there a few weeks ago.
It's there, but for symphony concerts, no. There was one exception when we did West Side Story. When I say we, I brought that production to Boston. Of course, they're running the film, and so they had a sound system there for the dialogue and other things. But the music was all live symphony orchestra music, and not amplified at all. So I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I had met Ben Zander. It was actually Richard Goldwater who kind of introduced me to the existence of Ben Zander years and years ago, when he mentioned how he preferred him over Seiji Ozawa. And I took that seriously, because I had only been to Boston Symphony concerts at that point. When I was sound director for the Boston Ballet, the assistant conductor was Mark Churchill from the New England Conservatory, and also Ben Zander's best friend. And Ben was nominated, his recording of the Bruckner Fifth was nominated for a Grammy. And so he went to LA for the Grammy Awards. He didn't win, but he was there for the awards. And on his flight back from Los Angeles to Boston, I was coming back from Hawaii. And so we were both sitting in first class, and I went over and I introduced myself to him. And that's how we began our relationship. And he said that he was conducting the Mahler Ninth at Jordan and Sanders in the next few weeks. Which one would I want to go to? And I said, both. And so I did. And it's just amazing. You talk about rooms. You would not have believed that this was the same orchestra, because the sound was so completely different in the two different rooms. Beautiful, yes, but different. And so, the hall is a very, very important instrument of the orchestra and a very major contributor to the sound you hear, of course. We all know that. And there are very few concert halls that are considered to be superior. Baranik's book listed, when he wrote it, only 3: Boston, Vienna, and Concertgebouw, Amsterdam. I've heard them all. I told him that Nashville would be the 4th, because I think Nashville is as good, if not better, than Symphony Hall. In some respects, it is better than Symphony Hall. So how do you get that kind of experience in a recording? Well, first of all, the recording has to be done in a good hall. And I have to say that with all of the controversy recently about the Symphony Hall broadcasts and their quality, whatever you want to call it, and perhaps the criticism implied of the engineers at Symphony Hall, I find them to be highly competent, and their selection of microphones, their placement of microphones is as good as it gets. And I could not be doing what I'm doing with Ben without their assistance and their cooperation. We get along very well. Their handicap is that they are monitoring the thing in a very small room with a very low ceiling and very small loudspeakers. When I say small loudspeakers, some people might think they're big. To me, they're small. They don't have dynamic range because they can't move enough air. And they're only using 2 of them most of the time, even though they have the third one, the center one there. But they have done something completely different than what Bill Busick and Jordan Whitelaw used to do. And of course, they made some wonderful broadcasts, and we have some wonderful recordings because of this. But they started off with just 2 microphones, and they went to 4, and then went to 5. But they were out over the seats. They never mic'd the piano. They would mic a soloist, but they never mic'd a piano. And I'll talk about pianos in a minute. The guys today are using what is commonly referred to as a decatry, which was something I'm sure Alan Southwick knows more about the origins of the decatry than I ever will, but it's a series of 2 pipes in a T-shaped situation. The left and right pipe, or left and right ends, are the left and right microphones. And then there's a center pipe that goes towards the back of the orchestra several feet, and the center microphone is put on that. It makes sense because the center part of the orchestra is recessed because the conductor's standing there. Those microphones are almost over the conductor. And I would have thought, without listening, that that was way too close because I was used to Bill's placements out in the hall, which were very good. But in listening to the decatry versus Bill's stuff, there are 2 things that I noticed. One is the center is weak and the rear is weak. The decatry does a really good job of picking up the balance and the perspective of the orchestra left to right and front to back. Front to back is generally not done as well. And also the center mic gives me the option of adjusting the balance of the center part of the orchestra. And oddly enough, depending on the staging, I have to adjust the level of the center microphone. And sometimes a dB, sometimes 2, sometimes none. But in order to recreate the sound that I hear when I'm there, there are things that I have to change. One of the things that I have learned in doing all of these is that the piano is a very, very difficult thing. A piano concerto, it may be impossible to record a piano concerto and have it sound the way it's supposed to sound as you hear it in the hall, because it's this giant thing in the middle of the stage right under the microphones, and the way the microphones hear a piano, and I'm using the word hear, obviously, for comparison, the way the microphones pick up sound, the way our ears hear sound, are completely different, particularly when you're that close to a giant instrument that's sitting right there and taking up a significant amount of space. So depending on how the pianist plays, there's a lot of playing around that you have to do. They do give me accent microphones on the piano and soloists. I use them when I need to, but I bring them in at -19, -14, -12, something like that. Not to bring up the level so much, but to bring up the perspective so they don't sound too far away. And sometimes they do. One of the things that was very interesting, if you go back, and those of you who might have the Mahler third that I sent out, that was an interesting experience. In fact, that's how a lot of this got started. I was there for the rehearsal and ended up being kind of the assistant conductor. The real assistant conductor was doing offstage stuff, post-horn and things. So I ended up being the ears in the room to balance the soloist, the chorus, the boys choir, and the offstage. And so the recording engineer sent me a 50 mic mix of the Mahler Third, and it was unlistenable. And I said, why don't you just send me the mains? And let's see what we have. Let's see what's missing, if anything. And to my great surprise, everything was there exactly as I heard it, including the chorus. Bill and Jordan had always used chorus mics, not a lot, but they were there. And I felt that they weren't really needed here. And so the Mahler Third is main mics only. It may be the best recording of the Mahler Third that's ever been done. And so since then, Cole and Nick, they've been sending me the individual microphone tracks. Left, center, right, left, rear, left wide, right wide, hall wide, left and right, and accent mics if there might be needed. And typically I'm using the Decatree and the hall mics, and occasionally, if necessary, an accent mic, but you won't know that I'm using an accent mic. The Das Lied von der Erde was interesting because in the hall, he was very strong singer, very loud, and so was she. But in the recording, even though they were standing the same distance from the microphones, him on the right, she on the left, she sounded a little farther away. So I did use her accent mic, again, at -10, and but not for him. And it took me 6 hours to get that right. It took me a long time to get that right. I've been having a lot of fun. One of the things that bothers me about multi-mic mixing is that the hall is not there. Nobody listens to a flute this far away, and the sound is different. And there are a lot of multi-mic recordings, particularly for Hollywood films, that sound very satisfying. But when you're mixing for a movie, you need a lot of microphones because the director may say, I want to balance things differently for this scene. And so you have to have that flexibility, and I understand that. But what I'm doing with Ben is not for a movie. It's simply to sit and listen to as good a representation of the concert event as I can. Now, I sent out these files. The Boston Symphony won a Grammy for the recording of the Shostakovich 10th. Those of you who have listened to it, you say it sounded good for some reasons. I think it's unlistenable. It's way too bright. I have to turn the treble down quite a bit. The dynamics are ridiculous, and the balance is gross. So I sent this out. This is the second movement. And on the left there, you see the Boston Philharmonic recording, which I did with Ben. And that is just the main mics, uncompressed, just fine. And in the middle is the Boston Symphony recording, second movement, of the same piece in the same room. And it's clipped and compressed. And on the right, if I reduce the level of the Boston Symphony recording to match or almost match the Boston Philharmonic recording, you'll still see a lot of density because of the compression. When you talk about the broadcast, that's really a different animal. Here is the Boston Philharmonic Bartok Concerto for Orchestra, beginning to end. And here is the broadcast of the Boston Symphony Concerto for Orchestra, looking almost like a stick of butter. I mean, it was just nothing but click, click, click. The broadcast, they should stop them, as far as I'm concerned. GBH does not care about the quality of the broadcast. It's very, very clear. Whatever they send them, they compress it, compress it, compress it. In Bill's day, there were 6 dB pads that they would patch into the link so that the STL, the studio transmitter link, would receive level 6 dB below what they would normally receive for normal broadcast. And the whole point was to increase the dynamic range of the broadcast. You're not allowed to overmodulate, so they had to be very careful. But the dynamic range of those broadcasts was quite good.
What about on that digital channel? Do they have more latitude?
Apparently, well, they would, but that doesn't mean they're going to use it. After Bill died, management at GBH evolved, and a woman came in, and I was still involved with them at that time. And her directive was, I don't care about people like me. They care about people in cars. It's got to sound good in a car. And
They told us that when we visited, and I think David complained about the compression, and they said basically too bad.
Yeah, cars are, that's what they're looking for. So when I have talked to the Boston Symphony about this, why aren't you just forgetting GBH and putting out your own stream? Because you have complete control of it. It's not very expensive. And, you could have the best sounding concert recordings being streamed out of anybody in the world. They're not interested. They're just not interested. They don't want to talk about it. So I don't know if any of you guys get Stereophile. I think it's Stereophile, but somebody sent me an article, and Mr. Austin, I guess, is the editor. And he was basically saying that he does not like minimal miking because it sounds dull. And I couldn't believe that. Anyway, I wrote a letter to him. I'm not going to read you the whole thing. I sent it, David Hadaway, I think I sent it to you or David Moran. So hopefully it would be put in the speaker, my response, and maybe even his letter. But anyway, at the end of my letter, I said, orchestral recordings are often criticized for the hole in the middle effect. When only 2 main microphones are used, the center instruments can sound weaker than they should. A center microphone can completely fix this. But it should be noted that while a center microphone is for balance, the center speaker, stereo was invented as a 3-channel format, the center speaker is for clarity. Normally, I stay away from accent microphones, mostly because they are so overused and exaggerated in so many recordings. But when used carefully, they can fix balance problems that can occur when making recordings and do so without being detected. When I do use them, I typically bring them in at -10 and sometimes as little as -19. As a point of interest, the recording that we did, I already mentioned this, the Mahler Third, used no accent microphones, even though we had a soloist, 2 choruses, and offstage musicians. On the other hand, the recording of the Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde had 2 soloists. I used the accent mic for one, but not the other. Do these recordings sound exactly like what I heard live in the hall? Of course not. But do they capture the beauty of the performance, the perspective of the orchestra, and the sound and the tone of the hall, as well as the excitement of the concert? Yes, they do. No one would ever call them dull. So I would be interested in hearing whoever might have listened to the Shostakovich comparisons, what you thought of them.
Well, I can give you some questions, but before I do that, Alan, what do they feed to the FM broadcast? Do they do the multi-miking, or are they doing just the mains to the FM broadcast?
Oh, I'm sure it's all multi-mic. I mean, you listen to them and it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed, and I got into a discussion with Mark Fishman on this, is the live, I guess, analog audio, if you want to call it that, goes up to CRB, which I cannot receive. And the HD broadcasts, which I can get from GBH, I think are running at a very, how shall we say, I'm not exactly sure of what the bit rate is, but it's not very good. The HD from CRB is a little bit better, but the best streaming rate is the one they put out on their internet feed. And that's up in the hundreds of kilobits per second, but I don't remember exactly what. But the other thing I've noticed, and this was a dead giveaway that I've been trained by John to listen to, is the applause. If you listen to the applause at the end of various parts of the BSO broadcast, it sounds like the audio is coming through about a 20-foot sewer pipe. And it's very constricted. It doesn't even sound like applause or rain. It's just awful. And the broadcasts that are going out digitally are pretty grim. And yeah, looking at a recent, and I don't know how many people were aware of it, but a while back, the Pacific Northwest section of the Audio Engineering Society did over a 3-hour broadcast talking to Nick Squires, and I forget the other fellow's name, John, but about how they record the symphony, and they do indeed put over 50 mics on stage typically, well, not typically, it varies from performance to performance, but they actually provided a map of the Shostakovich 15th that they did in 2019. And there's so much chance for comb filtering going on because there are 50 plus microphones all over the stage and extending somewhat out into the hall. And of course, it gets more interesting as the hall has 2 extensions. And that causes even more interest or more issues because the extensions move out beyond the actual projection area of the Symphony Hall shell. So it's definitely challenging, but the quality of the broadcast is just dismal.
In the early days, the Boston, and I'm talking about the 50s, the Boston Symphony management would never have allowed 50 microphones. They didn't even want to allow one. They wanted no microphones. They obviously had to have some, but they ultimately, when things went to stereo, they ultimately allowed basically 2 microphones to be hung over the orchestra. One, if you look at some of the older pictures, you'll see a shotgun over the woodwinds. And I asked Bill about that. And I think that was something the woodwind players said, we can't hear ourselves. And that may be because they weren't using a center microphone at the time. But you can, when you're listening to the recordings where that shotgun was used, you can tell, it's a different sound. And it's closer and not natural. But 50 microphones, you've got to watch where you step on the stage. You've got to.
Lots of cable.
But I will say again, in terms of selection of microphones and placement of microphones for that kind of recording, those guys really are very, very good. And the judgment, the decision to use those microphones is not one I agree with. Let's put it that way.
John, a couple of things. One is confirmation of what you were saying about music being modified to work in cars. I was at a Chicago AES section meeting at WFMT, and I think the gentleman's name, who's the chief engineer, happened to be McIntosh, and no relation to the company. But he took us through and he said, yeah, this is where we squish everything. And then I was at a DC section, AES section at NPR. Same thing. They had a whole section there where they were doing all the compression. And they said, the majority of our revenue comes from advertising to people who listen in their car on the way to and from work. And so that is unfortunately a reality of what's going on in the FM section. As far as the recordings that you provided, I listened to them in depth, and one of the things I noticed, which is very common with minimally mic'd recordings that are done properly, there was a great sense of space, and there was none of this Technicolor type instruments in your face all the time. I will say that I don't ever expect music being played back in my room to be like when I'm down at the hall, but I expect a reasonable facsimile. And if you can get a reasonable facsimile, that allows you to listen to all kinds of different music whenever you want to. But going back to your two recordings, the minimally mic ones were great. When I went to the multi-mic ones, I have a term that I use for that kind of sound, and it's called the milk sound. And why do I call it the milk sound? Because everything is homogenized. You lose the individuality of the instruments. You lose a lot of the transients. You lose a lot of the sense of space that minimal miking gives you. And it was like somebody took the recording, put it in a vise, and just squished it into 2 dimensions instead of 3 dimensions. The other thing, when I was listening to the bar talk, at first I thought it was a different orchestra almost. And the first few notes where you've got the timpani, I said, well, that can't even be the same timpani. And that's how off the sound was in that multi-mic one. And I don't know if that was the post processing or the result of the multi-mics, but very, very unpleasant.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that in order to somehow match the levels between the Boston Philharmonic recording and the Boston Symphony recording, I had to bring up the Philharmonic recording 12 dB. Now, neither of them was clipped because it was a second movement, which is a quiet movement. But just to show you what they're doing versus what I do, I had to bring it up 12 dB. And even then, it wasn't an exact match, but it meant that you didn't have to mess with your volume control all the time. And that's all I really was trying to help you with. But yeah, I agree with everything you just said. What I haven't heard you say, though, is how bright the Shostakovich Boston Symphony recording was. And I did something with that in my SMPTE work on the standards committee, we sometimes get a question either during SMPTE meetings or just questions pop up. And David Weinberg knows all about this. Somebody will say, well, if I'm mixing for a movie, if I'm doing some pre-dubs for a movie in a smaller room, do I need to equalize the speakers to the X curve? And the answer is no. And what it shows is a complete ignorance of what the X curve is. And those of you who don't understand how things work in movie theaters, I will explain. And those of you who do understand it will understand what I'm saying. The X curve does not exist. The X curve is a measurement phenomenon when you measure the flat frequency response of a flat loudspeaker in a big room. In other words, if I take the speaker here and it measures flat, and I take the same speaker and I put it in a movie theater and measure it, it sounds the same, but instead of measuring flat, it measures with a roll-off. And what John Allen did in determining what that roll-off should be and what it should look like and where it should begin is he was in a movie theater, a dubbing stage in Elstree, England. And they had speakers behind the screen 40 feet away from the console. And he set up some, I think they were KEF monitors 6 or 8 feet away from him, right in front of him, right in his face. And what he did was he equalized the screen speakers to match the tone of the monitors by ear, not by measurement, but by ear. And he spent a fair amount of time doing it. Then when he played pink noise through the monitors, it measured flat. When he played pink noise from the screen speakers, he saw what became known as the X curve. So what I decided to do was, well, let me put the X curve on this Shostakovich. Let's put this roll off on the high frequencies to see if perhaps they were monitoring on a speaker or a set of speakers that had been rolled off for some reason and boosted the treble to compensate for it, which would have made it too bright. And some of it almost made it perfect. And I didn't spend a lot of time with it. I just did a kind of an approximation of the X curve, but I knew I was on the right track. And that was very disturbing that this could happen. And I have noticed this in some other recordings where you just have to turn the treble down and it's unlistenable. So I'm a little surprised that nobody's picked up on that on the Shostakovich Boston Symphony recording.
The reason why I didn't mention the brightness, there were so many other things that bothered me. That I've heard a lot of bright recordings, but when you start losing the definition, when you start losing the transients, when you start losing, it becomes a two-dimensional thing. I don't worry about the fact that the balance is wrong. But you're right. The balance was not correct, but the other things were, in my opinion, much bigger problems.
Oh, it was a mess.
Yeah, it was.
They won a Grammy. And I got to tell you, it tells me more about the Grammys than it does about anything else. Perhaps somebody had a connection. I don't know, but these awards are often very political. I've been up to 3 Academy Awards. I can tell you it's very political. And recently, this being the 40th anniversary of me putting digital sound in a movie for the first time using Fantasia, the Disney Archives invited us to spend an afternoon with them and present the files that I had and Nelson Meacham's files, the Disney engineer who did this, to the archives officially. And we were in Walt's office. They gave us a tour, and we went to Walt's office, which still exists. And it's not used by anybody. It's it's there for special guests to see. And on the wall, to my surprise, was a Technical Achievement Award for Fantasound, which was the first stereo system they used in 1940 to present Fantasia in stereo, which was the first time any movie had ever been made that way. When we did Fantasia in 1985, Nelson, the thing that made it possible was a synchronizer that Disney had developed for Epcot. And they had applied for a Technical Achievement Award for this thing. And I should probably explain, Epcot, when it opened, they have auditoriums playing movies throughout the park, but the sound source for every one of those auditoriums is in one place in the middle of the park somewhere. And they send the audio over landlines along with time code. The time code tells the projector where to be and keeps the sound in sync with the projector. And that synchronizer was developed by Dave Barnett. And so they submitted for a Technical Achievement Award for this thing. And the Academy, in its lack of wisdom, in my opinion, said, oh, that's great, but you didn't use it in a real movie theater. Let us know when you do. So when we did use it in a real movie theater and changed the way movies are shown forever, ultimately, Nelson resubmitted this award along with the presentations of Fantasia and with the Disney engineers who made it possible, and included me in the application. So they just decided, well, it's not worthy of an Academy Award, which of course it is if you read their own definition of what's worthy. Well, 40 years later, of course, we see the results of what we did. And so I see this thing up on Walt's wall, this Technical Achievement Award. And I thought, I was talking to a couple of the guys there, and I said, geez, maybe we should bring Nelson's application out and resubmit it now that we've seen the results of what we did and what we achieved. And there was some interest in that. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, do I really want to get involved with the politics at the Academy again? And the answer was no. And I said, let's just drop. If it's their responsibility to know prior art, to know the history of things, to see how something might have been a small thing here, but made big changes later on. It's their responsibility to know these things, recognize these things, and award things, in an appropriate manner. And they're not very good at it. One of the things that, and this is a little off topic perhaps, when I did the Century Plaza in Los Angeles, I started getting a lot of interest from the engineers around town, because it was the best sounding theater in Los Angeles. And I'm not just saying that because I thought so. Everybody thought so, including the people at the Academy. And so one of the engineers at Glen Sound suggested that I should apply for an Academy Award. John Bonner and Don Rogers, who were co-chairman of the Technical SciTech Award Committee, agreed. And so I applied, and what I got back was unbelievable. It was rejected, but somebody said, well, a speaker is a speaker. And I thought, man, is that what they really believe? And but I said to the guy at the Academy I was talking to, I said, I wasn't applying for a speaker. Paul Klipsch made the speakers. I had nothing to do with that. I was applying for the formulas that I have developed that locate surround speakers for uniform coverage without any directional cues. And it works everywhere. The first one I did, of course, was Wellesley, as some of you heard. Plus or minus half of dB coverage. Again, no single speaker localization, no matter where you're sitting, even if you sit underneath one. And the sound of the surrounds match the sound of the screen without any EQ at all of the surrounds. That's what I was applying for. So he said, well, you should resubmit next year and make it very, very clear that that's what you're doing. So I did. And I was given some confidential information. The feeling of the committee was, oh, it's just an approximation. No one else has done this. How could this guy in Boston do it? Well, it's been 45 years and no one else has done it. And that still amazes me because it wasn't that hard. But they wouldn't even go down to the theater and listen to it. In 1982, 83, Paul Klipsch designed and developed a new tweeter for my big systems. It's a 40-watt, 109 dB tweeter. And it compensates for the beam spreading effect of a movie screen. 17 years later, JBL introduced a horn that they said compensated for the beam spreading effect of the movie screen. And immediately got a Technical Achievement Award. Mark Gander was their chief engineer, and at the Show West convention that year, the minute that trade show opened, he was standing in my booth. And he says, "What's new, John?" And I said, "Well, Mark, this correction for beam spreading is something we introduced 17 years ago." He said, "Do you have a paper on that?" And of course I do. I carry it in my briefcase all the time. And he stood there and he read it right there, the whole thing. And he said, "I might have known." And the reason I mention that story is that the Academy, in granting that award, made a serious mistake because they are responsible. They are charged with knowing about prior art. And if they want to go and give somebody a Technical Achievement Award for something, and it was invented 17 years earlier, and they don't mention that, they screw up. So I've gone kind of a far afield from what I wanted to talk about. I just want to say, I've been having a lot of fun making these recordings. If anybody is not on my list, that I send them out, send me an email and I will put you on the list. If there are recordings that you don't have and you want, I will do what I can to send them to you. It starts with the Bruckner Eighth. I think 4 or 5 years ago. Mahler 4, Mahler 3rd, Beethoven Piano Concerto 4, Rachmaninoff 2, Brahms 2nd, Bartok Concerto for Orchestra, Tchaikovsky Symphony 5, Schubert 8, unfinished. That was interesting. Schubert 8, unfinished, starts with the basses and cellos, da, 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 da. And something in the hall went crash right there. So I said, when something like that happens and it's something I can do something with, I ask for the rehearsal recording tracks. And I will substitute because they're the same mics, same orchestra, no levels have changed. And you can't tell. You really can't tell for something like that. We had in the Tchaikovsky first piano concerto this year, in the last couple of minutes, there was a what Ben called an ensemble mistake. There were some instruments that didn't play. They just missed the whole lick, and I was able to fix that. And again, without anybody knowing. One of the things that is probably the most fun to listen to is the William Tell Overture, because that has everything. It has this tiny little sound, and it has this huge orchestra. And of course, we all know that piece anyway. What I was interested in when they played it, when we did it at the Esplanade, of course, when the Lone Ranger theme comes in, the audience goes nuts. And what I wanted to see was, okay, is the audience in Symphony Hall going to go nuts as well? And they didn't. They were very quiet. But
did the Academy make up for its mistake in not knowing about your work?
No, and I stay away from it. That's why, I thought, should we reintroduce Nelson's application with the historical perspective that we now have? And I talked to a friend of mine at the Academy, and I said, I just don't think I want to mess with the politics that's involved here. I think that there is a little not invented here going on there. I felt that, this is just between us, but I have felt that in my experiences in Hollywood. Who is this guy from Boston? It's not that I haven't been successful there, but there has been resistance. In 18 years that system at the Century Plaza existed before the building was torn down and an office tower was put up. They would go in there for a premiere and retune the house, retune the system. We had 2 sets of equalizer cards in there, one for the house, mine, and one for them to screw around with, and they could do whatever they want. I was very, very angry when people would mess with my work. Plus the fact they never made it sound better. They always made it sound different, but never the same way. In 18 years, never the same way. Which tells you something. And so we had a premiere of, 2 things. We had the world premiere of a movie called A Passage to India, which was David Lean's last movie. And he was there. And I was there. It was a black tie event, and I had my tux with me, so I went. That morning, I hear a baby?
Yes.
Oh. That morning, gentleman that I knew from Columbia Pictures came in. I had worked with him before. And a guy from Dolby came in who had already wrecked that system one time and been embarrassed by what happened. And so he comes in and he sets up a music microphone in the grandstand. Now, this theater is 160 feet long and 92 feet wide. And he sets this thing up probably 130 feet from the screen, single microphone, and looks at a measurement of pink noise and says, "Oh, it's all wrong." And I said, "Listen, before you start messing around, this system was tuned over a period of a week with several 70 millimeter films and an instrumentation microphone and ears. To come in here without listening to anything and just set up a microphone somewhere and take a measurement and say it's all wrong without, again, listening to anything is crazy. Why don't you listen? Then we can talk." And the guy from Columbia who knew me and said, "Yeah, that's a good idea." So they went down into the house. The projection booth door was in the back of the theater, so it was easy to walk in and out. And I stayed in the booth while we started the film, just to make sure that everything was behaving the way it should. And then a minute into the film, I went out and started down the stairs into the theater. And they're running up the aisle, the Columbia people. "It sounds great. Leave it alone." So the guy from Dolby was really pissed and called the Plitt office, which was across the way, and demanded that I be removed from the theater, banned from the theater. And Ed Plitt comes over and he says to me, came to me first. He said, "What's going on, John?" And I said, "Same old shit." I said, "The movie sounds a little bright. The mix is a little bright. And but they're happy with it. I'll fix it tomorrow." And so the guy from Dolby ended up being banned from the theater because of his unprofessional behavior. After the film ran that night, David Lean was standing in the aisle, or standing in the lobby. And I was standing there with Ed Plitt and Henry Plitt and some other guys, just watching him shake hands with all of these people. You know, probably 1,500 people with him. And I said, "I'd give $1 million to know what he thought of the sound." And they said, "Well, why don't you go ask him?" And I said, "Is that all right?" They said, "Sure." I said, "Well, it would save me $1 million. So I went over, I waited for everybody to finish, and I introduced myself. "I'm John Allen, Mr. Lean. I designed the sound system. I hope you liked it." And he grabs me by the shoulders and starts shaking me. It was wonderful. A little too much trouble, though, don't you think? The guy had a good ears, and I said, "Yeah, I'll fix it tomorrow." He said it sounded better in the theater than the masters did at the mixing facility at Columbia, which is very significant because we were playing an optical 35 millimeter Dolby A print. That's all it was. And he was listening to the masters at the studio, and it sounded better in the theater. That's the difference between typical movie theater sound and what I tried to do. And getting back to Symphony Hall, it all stems from there. It all stems from the fact that I've been able to hear sound as good as it can be and knows what it, and learned what it should sound like.
Well, I want to go back to the differences between the two, number one and number two, the mains versus the multi-mic. And I'll start off by saying I endorse exactly what Tom said about the differences between the multi-mic and the, should we say, main micing is the way you described it. And what I did, because I heard loudness differences often between the two, I just ran it through Audition to find out who was louder, RMS-wise. And on the Bartok, the level was roughly 24 dB down on the left channel and 25 dB down on the right. So in other words, the main, the simple miking was slightly lower and it was audible, and was very audible difference on the Shostakovich, where the the left channel on the multi-mic recording was down 17 dB. And on these are average RMSs, by the way. And on the mains, it was down as much as 21 dB. So in other words, there was a roughly 3-4 dB difference between the two in loudness, and that was really audible. And Tom is very right about the Bartok. The Bartok multi-mic, it was unlistenable, I thought. And the bass was strange. And the whole ambience was really loud. And on the Shostakovich, the left and right on the multi-mic was extreme, or what we call extreme stereo. There was sort of a center, but it was extreme, whereas the horns sounded to the right and the drums sounded way to the left. On the mains, there was a center, more fully balanced, sounded more correct, and less of that stereo effect that you get with the ping pong, is what we used to call it in the 60s when it started making a big deal. So my RMS reports pretty much confirm what I also heard about as far as loudness is concerned. And the Bartok was probably the easiest of all of the two recordings. I did say at the opening I preferred both. In other words, I didn't think that the multi-mic, it was horrible. It just wasn't as good as the minimum miking. I'll call it what you call the main miking.
Well, you got to remember in the Bartok, I brought the level up 12 dB. So you can't really compare levels with the Bartok. You can with the Shostakovich. But the other thing is, when you do, one of the last things you do in a recording where you're mixing things together, as you mix them together, the amplitude gets greater and greater. You don't want to clip, but you want it to be as loud as it can be without clipping, and that varies from piece to piece. And one of the things that I'm thinking about, if you listen to the last thing we just did, which was the Mozart 24th Piano Concerto and the Bruckner 9th. To my ears, that's as good as a recording can be of a symphony orchestra. The piano concerto, the pianist was sometimes hard to hear in the hall, but very easy to hear in the recording. And I think that I've got it as good as it can get. I don't think I can make it any better. I brought the center mic down 2 dB. I brought the halls up a dB, and that seemed to knock it into where it needed to be on the piano concerto. What?
I'd like to add a question. Earlier, you said that the microphones they've chosen for the BSO recordings are roughly over the conductor's head, and that the 50 mic recordings are, of course, within 2 or 3 feet of the instruments.
Well, they're all there. All of them are always there, the mains and the stage mics. And but the decatry is pretty much over the conductor, and that gets moved as the stage extension gets put in and out, because the stage extension is quite variable. It might be out here, this one for this concert, and here for this one. I personally don't like the stage extension at all. Management doesn't like it either because they lose seats, but it does change the sound of what you hear in the hall, because it brings the first out beyond the proscenium, and you don't have the shell, the benefit of the shell.
Right, but my question relates not to that so much.
So the accent mics are always there, and the one of the things I forgot to mention is that in the middle of all of this, I can't remember when it was, within the last year, they changed the microphones on the decatry without telling me. They're not obliged to tell me, but I was listening to the Beethoven Seventh and thinking to myself, man, this thing really sounds great. I wonder what the orchestra did that was so different. Well, it turns out it wasn't the orchestra, it was the microphones. They went from Sennheisers to Schoeps. And they have decided, and I agree, that the Schoeps are the ones that are preferred. They do sound more clear than the Sennheisers, which were very, very good. Before that, they were using B&K 4006s, which I used at the ballet. I don't think that is the best microphone for Symphony Hall. For the ballet, it was great, but in the pit, where I had the microphones in the pit. But for hanging them over an orchestra, I think that the Schoeps do a much, much better job. And of course, these things there's nothing perfect in any of this,
But my question is pretty much right there. Since none of the microphones is in the audience, why should one microphone?
That's not true. The hall mics are over the audience. And one of the things that I have to, Al talked about the applause. One of the things I have to do, and I try to do it so that nobody can tell that I'm bringing the level down of the microphones or the applause, but I'm bringing the applause down 6 to 8 dB. So I have to catch it at the very, very beginning and bring it down so that nobody notices it. But one of the things I'm going to try in the future is to mute the hall microphones for applause, because they're just contributing way too much. And what I would like to be able to do is hear a concert, a recording, without having to go from what is too loud in the applause to up to the gain level that I want for the music. So I'm still working around with that.
Yeah,
But there are microphones over the audience.
Yeah, I put the YouTube link for their presentation up on the chat site, and also in that presentation, about 20 minutes in 1938, according to it, because I pulled it up on another screen, they actually have a pictogram of the mic layout for the Shostakovich 15th rather. And they also get into talking about the microphones and so forth that we used then. And yeah, you're right, John. They use some Sennheiser MKH 800s according to the mic chart that they put up. They have a whole spreadsheet of all the 50 mics, where they're located, what they do. And the chart, as I recall, the green mics are on the chart, and I could pull it up if you want to share the screen, but the green mics are the mics that are suspended from the ceiling. And they have quite a grid laid up on the area over the stage and out into the audience. And then they have a bunch of red mics noted for this performance. And you got to remember, this is a Shostakovich piece, all kinds of percussion, all kinds of not extraordinary instruments, but certainly strange usage of the instruments. And there is a forest. I'm looking at the picture, and there is a forest of red mics on the stage. And John mentioned you have to watch where you're stepping when you walk out on the stage from the cables all over the stage. And then you've got a forest of mics hanging as well. But yeah, there are 4 mics out in the hall. The furthest ones out face the orchestra. The ones that are a little closer to the stage extension actually face out into the hall, which is a little odd from my estimation, but that's what they're doing.
What are they doing with these hall mics? What channelization are they going to?
Left and right.
Yeah.
That would be a mistake. That sound would sound like it's coming from behind the orchestra then, unless you put it in surround channels.
Very, very low level. It's only for
what they're doing.
Bring in the ambience of the room. It's down at least 10 dB.
Blends it in.
Yeah, they're also recording for Dolby Atmos at the same time as the stereo.
Yeah. Thanks, David.
Well, 2 things have come up that maybe I could comment on. One is somebody mentioned the bass. We haven't talked about bass very much. In Bill's day, the bass balance from week to week that we would hear over the air would change. And sometimes within one concert, it would change. And that was because the staging would change. from piece to piece. And it had a huge effect on the bass balance that we were hearing picked up by those microphones. That seems to be less of an issue with the Decatry being closer. And, but of course, I'm listening to the mic's live feed out of the console versus a broadcast, which would have limited bass anyway. But still, the bass with the Sheps and with the Sennheisers is very, very good. And, you know, it's very natural, very big. The bass drum at Symphony Hall, by the way, has, for the Boston Symphony several years ago, they did something to it. And I'm not quite sure what, but it was quite noticeable. And everybody knew that they had done something. We all heard it. The other thing I want to talk about is Atmos. It's a gimmick, and but there are some positives about it. And for a movie theater, the ceiling speakers are kind of a waste in a way, because we've always, at least in my theaters, but always been able to have sound appear over our heads. Bullets flying over our heads, back and forth, front to back, left to right. Even with mono surrounds, they can be, the tracks can be mixed in such a way that you can do these phantom images that are quite accurate and very convincing. Then the advantage of the ceiling speakers isn't so much in perspective, but it does give you more acoustic power because you have more speakers and more amplifiers, because every one of the surround speakers in an Atmos system has its own amplifier. It's really a pain in the ass. And in Top Gun Maverick, that secret plane that takes off and flies over our heads. If you notice, by the way, that little shed that they put at the end of the runway kind of blew apart because it was a real plane taking off, but it wasn't the one that you saw on the screen. It's probably an SR-71. And it blew the roof off the thing. But anyway, that effect of the flyover used every bit of the power of an Atmos system with all of those ceiling speakers. So you can't say we don't need them. For most movies, you don't need them. But I will say there's one thing about the Atmos system that is really very, very helpful. And that only occurs in theaters with really large screens, where as the screen gets bigger and the speakers stay in the same basic place, you have all of this screen area, like IMAX, with no sound behind it at all. And it makes no sense. And so what Dolby has done is put speakers around the screen, left and right and above, and what I call the halo. And that allows them to place sound anywhere within the image that they want. And that's really, really great. One of the things a mistake that they made, a lot of good work went into developing Atmos. But one of the mistakes that they made was, it appears to me that they gave up on trying to cover the entire room with surround coverage uniformly, even though I had done it in 1979, 1980. And so they designated a sweet spot in the middle of the seats, and they're aiming the speakers in funny ways so that the sweet spot gets the best surround coverage. And I think that's a cop-out. And I have to say they are a pain in the ass, but it's another way of listening to sound. And when done well and utilized, not so much as a gimmick, but as to enhance the natural effect of a real event, it's really kind of neat. But for home, geez, a lot of divorces. I just don't see. I mean, what are they doing? They're taking speakers and they're shooting sound at the ceiling. That kind of gimmick just doesn't work for me.
I was at a local presentation by the AES in Philly at one of the Dolby theaters, and they had a couple of people from Dolby talking about different aspects of Atmos. and the presentations they did with movies was quite impressive. And then they played some music, and it was horrible.
So music doesn't benefit from Atmos.
It's destroyed by Atmos, at least in that presentation, and they were doing everything they could, but it was a milk sound to the nth degree. Everything was homogenized, and it just didn't work for me.
Well, we've all been to concerts where they had instruments out in the balconies. Berlioz Requiem is one. Carmina Burana is another, where they'll actually put instruments or singers out in the audience area. And in the Berlioz Requiem, Brad Meyer and I were there for that. And I have to say, I almost jumped out of my seat. I really had to control myself because the sound was so incredible. When all of those horns from all around me started playing, particularly that particular piece. If you know the Berlioz Requiem, you know what I'm talking about.
It's the tuba mirum portion.
Yeah, it was one of the most wonderful experiences I ever had in music.
Yeah,
because it grabbed your emotions, and it was fabulous. But if you don't have instruments out in the hall like that, you're not particularly, unless you're listening the way I do to everything that's happening acoustically in the hall. If you're just sitting there listening to the music, you're not aware of so much the sound that is around you. And for instance, what I talked about this in New York when we were doing the Geffen Hall tour. In my seat at N22, the first significant reflection I get is off the face of the left front balcony, the first balcony. And I am not aware of that at all. But if I turn and cup my ears and look at it, it is loud. It is really loud. And yet, when I'm just facing the orchestra, I'm not aware of it specifically. So to put speakers in a home over your head for music, I mean, they've tried it with quadraphonic recordings and putting instruments around you, and that's just not the way we hear music. And but for movies, it's a different story. I can understand it for movies, but for symphony music, which is what I listen to mostly, I don't have surround speakers at my house. It's interesting. I invented this way of building surround arrays, and I don't even have it in my own house because I don't really miss anything without.
Do you like headphones at all?
No. For one thing, I think they're dangerous. And there was somebody, one of you guys might know the name of this, but John Bonner, he was chief engineer at Warner Hollywood Studios, as well as co-chairman of the sound committee at the Academy. Great guy. And he sat me down in a room one day. He said, I want to see what you think of this. And he put a set of headphones on me. And it was a recording that was made with microphones, I guess, where your ears would be. And one of the things was somebody cutting hair.
Huh.
And so it sounded like my hair was being cut, which was really funny because I haven't had hair in years. And following the scissors around my head. And literally localizing as it went around, cutting hair. Brad Meyer made the point, yes, it works very well with sounds behind you, but not so well with sounds in front of you. And he was right about that. And I'm not quite sure why, because our ears basically, they face forward. And, but no, headphones, they're useful when you have to use them, yes, but it's not a way of listening that I care about because I don't feel any air.
John, an interesting meeting I went to, the Chicago section AES, and I can't remember the name of the gentleman. He was their technical guy at AES for the longest time. He passed away not too long ago. But he brought a little Sony Walkman, and he had a couple of microphones that were designed to go in your ear. So it took advantage of your individual HRTF. and you could walk around the room, talk to people and everything, and then you played it back within your headphones. Oh my God, it was amazing. Everything, not just behind you, but every direction, because it was recorded with your own HRTF.
Yeah, Dave Griesinger has done a lot of work in that area and has also developed some interesting ways of calibrating his binaural system to your own individual HTRF. And I remember at one time there was I think it was a walkthrough or something of Symphony Hall, and David showed up, and sure enough, he had the wires were hung over his ears, and the microphones were actually about the size of your little fingernail. They were quite small and suspended, and he was recording the discussions and so forth. And he's done extensive work in that area, and he's written a whole bunch of papers for the AES and so forth. I think he's still fully functional. None of us are getting any younger, but he's really been a pathfinder in that area, and also in developing HTRF type stuff.
In the demonstration that I took part in, I think the microphones were the same ones used by Etymotic Research for their hearing aids, and they actually sat in the ear canal, so that everything about your HRTF was taken into account.
Yeah, David has gone to that extent with some of the stuff he actually wears. They look like the newer type of hearing aid where there's an actual pipe that goes into your ear, into the ear canal. And I remember talking with him a couple of years ago at an AES convention in New York about it.
An interesting aside, I did a book report for Audio Amateur years ago, and it was talking about sound and speakers and microphones. And there was a reference to a guy back in the 1600s that took and measured people's ability to determine direction of sound. Then he made some brass tubes, stuck them in their ears so that they extended out past the pinnae, and they lost some of the ability to locate sound. And then he made wax molds of their pinnae, stuck them on the end of the brass tubes, and they got back some of the ability to localize. And that was back in the 1600s. So anybody who says all this stuff is recent, well, they haven't studied history.
Did the effect that you heard in the demo of the binaural stuff depend on not moving your head?
Actually, yes, because my head was in a certain position when it was recorded. And obviously, if it was played back and my head was in a different position, what it did is if I was listening to somebody in front of me and I played it back and I turned, well, they were no longer in their original position. They were still in front of me.
It didn't,
which is not a correct position, but that there was no head tracking or anything on that. It was just a demonstration of how HRTF gives you the ability to localize, not necessarily that you're going to be in an absolutely perfect position without head tracking.
I would hazard a guess as to why you could localize when the sound was behind you but not in front of you, and that would be the disconnect between what you're hearing and what you're seeing.
Your seeing always takes absolute precedence, no doubt.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's probably 100-to-1 ratio. If you can hear something from any direction, but if you see the tiger running at you from the front, you're not going to run to the front, even if you hear the sound reflecting off a building behind you.
It's just that binaural is much more effective the closer you get to your head than farther away. The haircut recording is something that Professor Chawiri uses all the time to sell his binaural stuff.
I tend to disagree with that, because when I was walking around the room, people were not really that close to me. It was a pretty big room at the AES meeting. And again, without tracking, the people weren't in the right position when I played back. But as far as locating people, front, back, sound from the sides, other people talking, it was pretty convincing. And it didn't have to be really close to me to be convincing. You got the sense of depth and distance.
Yeah, I still remember, and it was a vivid experience. I did recordings way back in the day in the old, oh gosh, I don't remember what they called the hall. It was down on Tremont Street in Boston. It was an old vaudeville house that they'd converted to a sort of theater way back in the day. I had to be making recordings there probably in the 80s. And it was right next to Berkeley Street. Well, it wasn't next to it, but the Berkeley Street Fire Station was just up the street. And I happened to be recording a concert of the Beethoven, I think it was the fourth, which starts off very quietly. And I was using crossed figure eight, crossed XY pattern, crossed cardioids. And that was a single mic, crossed cardioids, suspended from the second balcony in the building. And all hell broke out in the fire station, and trucks came down, and I was playing it back on a Dynaco system, which was basically a 4-speaker system, front, center, 2 sides, and a rear speaker. And you actually, it was so impressive to hear the fire trucks come down on your right side, swing around behind you, and go down the street. I actually, listening in my cellar listening room in another location where I used to live, I actually turned around and tried to watch it. It was just a stunning demonstration of what you can do, and it was a very simple setup, really, to do it. And that
Can you imagine back in the early 1900s when there was no air conditioning at Symphony Hall and the windows were open and they had cobblestone streets, on carriages, what it was like to listen to a concert in that room. You can still, from time to time, hear a siren in Symphony Hall. It doesn't happen very often, but it happens.
Yeah, that hall is just, it has to be quite loud and channeled up because the hall is basically a hall within a hall.
Yeah, but the
window's way up or up. Yeah, they're on the street level basically, or the street sides and around the building.
Now, Nashville has windows, but they're 3 feet thick.
Ooh. Wow.
In fact, one of the tests that they made was they had a guy standing on the roof with a 20-gauge shotgun.
That'll do it.
And they couldn't hear it inside the room, inside the home.
Wow. That's impressive.
Yeah, it's 2 layers of glass, one 3 inches thick, one 2 inches thick, and 2 feet apart or something like that.
Yeah, they were talking about something similar when we went to the AES Accentec meeting that BAS members also went to a couple of months ago, in terms of some of the construction of one of the buildings. It was a part of, I guess, a college campus set up for kind of the student union area. And they had big open atrium, and they had put offices around it for some of the professors. And they had some issues with noise and sound, and they used a similar technique to basically isolate the professors' offices.
Well, anyway, I hope you have, guys who have been listening to my Ben Zander recordings, I hope you've enjoyed them, and I just thought I would explain how they came about. I thought we could do a meeting on it, so there it is.
Great meeting, John.
Yeah.
We lost Dave Moran. I wonder why.
Probably the dog got to barking at him. My wife came down at one point and said, "Have you fed the dog?" And I said, "Oh, no, I haven't yet tonight." So she said, "I'll take care of it."
So, Al, have you listened to the Shostakovich on your Klipschorns yet?
I didn't listen to the Shostakovich. I listened to some of the Bruckner. And one of the things I noticed, and maybe it's just me, or maybe it's something, I don't listen to the system as much as I should, and I may have dirty contacts or something, but the left channel, there was a nice general imaging across it. I tend to be an imaging freak of sorts, but I found the left channel seemed to be light, and maybe it was an orchestra layout, maybe it's my hearing, which is not as
Which Bruckner you were speaking about?
Huh? This was the Bruckner.
Which one?
The ninth.
The one we just did, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I would say definitely it's your system. Now, of course, there's a lot of brass in that.
Yes. Yes.
And they are up on the right.
And most of the strings seem to be coming from the right, which was either a layout issue that Ben did or something.
That's your system somehow.
Violins were somewhat lost. You could kind of place them and hear them on occasion. And I went back and checked some of the other recordings that I've done, and it didn't seem to be that dramatic. I ran some pink noise, I ran some speech through it, and it's dead center that way.
How about did you listen to the Mozart piano concerto?
I did listen to a little of that. It's very nice.
Nice.
And the piano was actually, that one was slightly to the left on the piano, I noticed, from off center. Now, it may be just that I'm sensitive to it, or it may
You don't have a center channel, do you?
I do, but I don't use it.
Why?
I'm able, well, I have actually a 5.1 surround if I want to use it, but I use a what is it? It's a Lexicon DC2, I think it is, which gives me a music surround. But if I'm doing real critical listening or production, I will wind up using just the 2-channel feed.
Well, I derive the center channel by summing the left and right. The speaker has the same mid-range driver and tweeter as my left and right channels, and I delay it about 2 milliseconds, let's say, roughly. And the level of the center channel varies from room to room. Here it's a minus, I think, 11 dB. The system I had in Boston, I sold to a friend, and in his room, to get the same balance, the speaker is down 8 dB. I do not understand that, but it's all done by ear anyway. But the center channel makes a small but important difference and costs a lot of money. And but I wouldn't have it without.
Yeah, I have an Allison. I forget which model it is. Someone with a sloped woofer on the front, and that's my center channel. And I use it, with movies and so forth in the studio I've got, and it comes out very nicely if everything's working. But contacts being what they are, I did find that there were some variations in output, noise, and so forth. Just dirty contacts on some of the connectors. I haven't really messed with the details of the system in quite a while, but I was surprised that when I listened,
you did put it in. You put my mid-range drivers in your speakers, right?
Yes, yeah. I even listened to the speaker. I mean, I had some tables or lower stuff in front of the one on the left, and I went ahead and cleared away and actually put my ears to the tweeter and the squawker just to make sure they were both working okay. And they sounded fine. So I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I did listen to some of my recordings, and maybe it's just they were mastered on this system, so they sounded fine. But I did find that the strings on the left did not seem. I mean, there was some imaging slight to left, but not full left.
I'll listen to it again, but
yeah, but as I say, it may be just my hearing. It may be a flaw in the system. I don't know. I wouldn't take it too seriously, John.
Question: Could you folks both describe your speaker layouts? You're using Klipschorns?
Customized Klipschorns. John has basically worked with Paul Klipsch and also developed his own crossovers, come up with new mid ranges, and I have two Klipschorns, just front speakers. In a room that's, I don't have the dimensions handy at the moment, but it's like 12 by 17 or thereabouts, with about a 10-foot ceiling. And it's all solid concrete or cinder block, sand-filled cinder block walls, and a lead lined double coverage of wallboard ceiling.
Okay, speaker positioning.
And the speakers are at the extreme front of the width of the room, not the length. And the listening position is probably about, maybe 8 feet back, because again, you don't have the depth. I tried it the other way with the Klipschorns in the short wall, playing into the length of the room, and it doesn't sound anywhere near as good.
Yeah, but they're not in the corners of the room, are they?
Yeah, they're in the corners. They're corner placement.
You can use a 12-foot spread, but it's too narrow. I have that in Newton. I have about 15 here, So the room is 15 wide, about 20 feet deep, and an 8.5-foot ceiling. I was interested in your comments about ceiling height, because ceiling height is very important.
Are your speakers in the corners?
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, the Clipshrines have to be. That's the way they're designed.
There's a lot of people who say, well, you don't. They put corners on it. If you want proper coupling to the air in the room, you put them in the corner.
Yeah.
They have to be.
Got some work to do here.
And I have a bell clips in the middle with my mid-range drivers and my tweeters. And my tweeter is a copy of the Electro Voice T35, which Klipsch has used, until recently. They actually, when Electro Voice stopped making it, I had to start making it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had a tweeter. And I was able to find a company that would do it for me. And we're making a better tweeter than Electro Voice did, and a much better mid-range than anybody ever did. And but it took some real dedication and patience to get these drivers to be as good as they are. The mid-range took 10 years. 10 years and $150,000. So that was an enormous effort, but boy, did it ever pay off.
Yeah.
But I'm also using a balanced differential amplifier, and I mentioned that at a recent meeting that we had. And there is no other kind of amplifier. That's a significant improvement in amplifiers over anything else. And in clarity and low frequency control. Boy. So yeah, I'm very lucky to have what I have.
Recording something in Atmos, say at Symphony Hall, a classical music piece, doesn't add anything when played back on an Atmos system?
I haven't heard it. I wouldn't know how they would record it.
I thought you said they were making Atmos recordings at Symphony Hall.
I'm the one who said that, and yes, they are.
But I think it may be a processing thing as opposed to putting microphones in certain places.
No, they do. They definitely have, I think, 9 or so microphones that are there for that specific purpose.
Yeah, you know where they are?
It's in that meeting. If you watch the video,
but do you know where are they located in the room?
It was stated during that meeting, but I didn't memorize it.
Yeah.
I don't do that kind of recording myself, and it's not.
Yeah.
Not a subject of
the room
the
room they have it in is just a very bizarre room. Having actually been in it, it's not the best place to actually even listen or produce music.
You mean the monitoring room?
Yeah. Well, it's the production room. That's where they have the mixing console. They have the capability of mixing some 60 or 70 channels if they want. And it's heavily automated. It's computer. I would call it an Ethernet nightmare because there are cables and wires and everything all integrated into the digital processing systems that they use. And it's if you really want to find out in depth about some of the details that you're talking about, as I say, I posted the YouTube link. It's a good 3 hours plus, but it's an interesting presentation by two guys who seem to know really pretty well what they're doing. They do have a side console that they supposedly used at one time for the broadcast mixes, but I'm not sure they're using it anymore. They just pump whatever comes out of whatever they reduce to 2 channels and send it through the links, which is kind of unfortunate. The original broadcast system for GBH was set up by was it General Armstrong? I think that's what he called himself. I don't know if he was an actual general, but he was the guy that invented FM radio. And I believe it was 1950, the very first broadcast from WGBH was a microwave linked signal of a mono recording of a Boston Symphony concert. And at the time,
Live concert. It wasn't recording. It was
yeah, it was a live concert.
Yeah.
And the fun part, it was mono. And the fun part was they didn't quite know what to do during intermission, so they just left the mic open. And you hear all the audience noise and so forth. And I think I've managed to purloin one or two of the very early stereo recordings back in the day of some pieces that I enjoyed listening to. For one reason or another, I think I have a recording of, I'd have to go rummage a bit, but of Pierre Monteur conducting the orchestra in the piece he premiered, the Le Sacre de Printemps of Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring.
Those of us who have lived in Boston and grown up with Bill and the BSO broadcasts are really fortunate.
Mm.
Really fortunate that we have this level of quality as a reference.
Yeah.
It was Major Edwin H. Armstrong, inventor of FM.
Thank you. The other John Allen.
So says Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Yeah, he lived I believe, in Boston. Committed suicide.
Yeah.
Jumped out a window.
He was either in Boston or New York City, but he was driven to practically do it by Sarnoff at RCA, because Sarnoff had literally bought up just about every patent you could think of for AM radio. And when FM radio came along, he started into patent fights with Armstrong, who was basically a kind of on his own. And Sarnoff had the power of the Radio Corporation of America behind him and just basically blocked him again and again and again. And eventually the RCA folks adopted FM radio for television broadcasts.
Well, RCA also was behind moving the FM radio broadcast, which had existed before World War II, in 50 megahertz band up to 100 megahertz, which put all of Armstrong's equipment out of use.
Mm.
One of the things he did. I think Sarnoff also did nasty things to the inventor of a lot of things to do with television. I forget what his name was.
Philco.
Philco, yeah.
Phil.
He also really screwed Columbia Broadcasting by getting the FCC to overturn the decision to accept the Columbia color system.
Well, that was developed in the 20s. And my grandfather was chief engineer for AT&T Long Lines, and his office was on Wall Street. And there he told me about a life-size color television image, Columbia image, that was in the window of a building down there that people could walk by on the street and see. And he said the color was incredible, the picture was incredible, and he felt that it was better than what NTSC came along with. The problem with the Columbia system was it was not compatible with black and white. And
it was not compatible. It was also based on a mechanical rotating wheel.
Right. Yeah.
That could have been made electronic eventually, but the incompatibility was the basis for David Sarnoff asking the FCC to reconsider.
And I think that was the right decision.
I agree. And by the way, the Columbia system found a second life in the Apollo program. We have articles about that in old issues of the Speaker. And wondering how they changed sequential color into an NTSC system. It was really clever, pre-digital. They had this rotating wheel with 3 pickups, a magnetic disc with 3 pickups at 120 degrees, so that they could pick up the three primary color images and combine them into a single one. Very clever.
Well, I think the NTSC system was very good for what it needed to be, and the cameras got dramatically better over the years. But
And NTSC was a remarkable compromise
Yeah.
and shoehorning of the color signal into an existing luminance signal.
And
Yeah,
it only got
they call it a
got
burst, if
better
you
with
recall.
time.
The color signal was just a tiny little burst,
Mm.
3.58 megahertz, that was stuck into the video.
And the European improvement over NTSC with PAL, a very small change made an incredible improvement in color stability.
Well, I do remember that the RCA TK41 camera, 40 and 41, image orthicon tubes, 3. The green tube was used for the black and white. These things were giant.
Oh, yeah.
And the cables, and there'd be a guy in a control room for each of the cameras. And they spent, before a show, they would spend an hour at least with a model sitting in a chair in the studio, looking at her and getting the flesh tones right. Not only right, but balanced between all the cameras.
Yeah.
And and it was just an enormous amount of work to put on a color television program.
If you ever want to, go ahead.
Oh, you can see one of those cameras at the museum in Woonsocket, where
Yeah.
DAS had a meeting. Fascinating place.
Yeah, the Museum of Broadcast Technology.
Right.
And, they took over an old bank building up there, and it's they use the vault to store tubes.
They've
But
got
they have functional what is it, VTR 1000 video recorders.
they've got 28 quad machines.
Yeah.
And
They're getting to the point, last I was up there, where they
half of them actually work.
they have so much stuff that they're running out of places to put anything.
Well, that's been a problem for a long time.
Yeah, because all the old gear that the studios are upgrading goes to them. And it's like, I don't know whether the studios, the active studios, can take discounts for donating it possibly to a museum, but they're running into the situation where they don't know where they're going to put everything. But the amazing
Well,
thing
when you
is
think
most
about
of
it,
works.
Al, our iPhones have better cameras than TK41s
Oh yeah.
and better video recorders than the VTR 1000s that Ampex.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it's
Well, it's analog over to digital, and
Plus digital televisions do a very poor job at reproducing analog source material. So it's making the NTSC archives look worse.
Mm.
Well, they're rerunning the Tonight shows, Johnny Carson shows, and some of them look good and some of them don't. It's hard to know what their source material is.
It's really a function of the quality of the transfer and the quality of the original, because I've seen, and I have myself placed and processed video and placed it on YouTube, and it's very sharp and very nice. But there's a lot of poor quality transfer that occurred before the tools became available to deinterlace properly. I mean, now you can turn interlaced 30 frame per second video into 60 frame per second video, and the motion is just butter smooth. And the artifacting is almost absent. So it can be done. But my concern, and I expressed this in an article in the Speaker a year or two ago, was that a lot of the original material will be lost once it's transferred the first time. Someone will say, "I'll throw away the original," but it will have a lot more detail and better motion capture than the transfer.
I have seen the Johnny Carson archives are somewhere in a mountain in Colorado where studios archive videotapes. I think you're probably right. There's no need to keep going back to the source. They get it once, they transfer it to a DVD and make as much money as they can.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite examples is of the Leonard Bernstein conducted West Side Story, which was made as an audio recording, but there was video shot of it. And the video you can see of it is just really not up to the quality that you would see through a good transfer. You have interlacing artifacts. You have doubled images because they took it down from 60 to 30, but they didn't deinterlace it first.
Oh.
That kind of nonsense. And this, this is a historic, document.
It's like us growing up watching silent movies.
Yeah.
There are a few YouTube videos showing how a silent movie can be cleaned up and retimed and look quite good.
Oh, look terrific.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's documentary footage of New York City from 1908, and holy cow, does that look good. It's really sharp. The image doesn't weave. And they took it, they used interpolation to take it up from 16 frames per second or whatever it is to 60.
Well, again, it's a matter of having the right tools and having the attention to detail to make it happen.
And really giving a damn. There are some people that care about quality, and fortunately, some are still in the movie business.
Yeah. And then there are some that just, they're there to catch a paycheck every week.
One of the first consumer electronics shows I attended in the 1980s, I was at a presentation by sound engineers who I think may have been working on Star Wars. And they presented what was on the film, and then they said, here's what we would have liked to put on the film if they gave us enough time.
Was that the one that we did at the Ziegfeld? No.
Don't know.
Well, it's like the old quality saying, you can have it fast, cheap, and good. Pick any two. And that's true.
Like Hoffman's Iron Law.
John, hi. I wanted to ask you about something you mentioned in passing. It means a lot to me just because I have a working relationship with Sheps. In fact, I spent pretty much all of last month in Germany at the Sheps company doing a long-term research project that I've been doing there for a number of years. The meeting that the Pacific Northwest AES had with Sean Murphy and Nick Squire was only 6 or 7 weeks ago. And they still said that their main microphones were Sennheisers.
Yeah.
And so you're telling me that they changed to Sheps mics in the meantime since then? Do you happen to know which capsules are involved or which?
No, I don't.
Yeah, the original mics they listed were the MKH 800 Twin NX mics that Sennheiser makes, but I don't know what they switched to.
Okay, so that is a dual diaphragm pressure gradient microphone. And if you want to get an omnidirectional pattern out of that, you're basically synthesizing it by taking two cardioids and putting them back to back and adding their signals together, which is not the same thing as a pressure transducer gives you. It's not the same kind of sonic impression, especially regarding low frequencies. Whereas the Sheps microphones are single diaphragm, small diaphragm, pure pressure transducers of the classic sort. But they make 5 different models. So I was just wondering if anybody knew which type it was. And I'm just surprised that they would make that fundamental a change, and they didn't say anything about it in the meeting we had.
I think they did leave contact information, David. You could ask him.
I suppose so.
Well, the first use of the ships was October of 2023. I just looked it up. But I don't.
Well, see, our meeting with them was April 23rd, 2024, and they said they were using Sennheiser main mics.
They are.
Well, they may have been talking about the 2019 recording too for the shuttle.
Yeah, that could be. That really could be.
Microphones that they send, those tracks that they send me are definitely ships.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, I'm glad you like them.
What's that?
Yeah, I go back to the days when Victor Campos was recommending them to anybody who would listen.
Yeah.
And that goes back.
That's what Jack Renner used to tell her. He used ships.
Yeah.
First time I actually heard of them, and his recordings are spectacular.
Yeah.
Well, the type that he was suggesting would not be appropriate for semi-distant placement like they use in Symphony Hall. So that was a bit of a problem. But that's a whole other discussion. Thank you.
Time to go.
Yeah, if there's nobody else, then
the mind will absorb only what the bladder can endure. It's good to see everybody. John, you've done a spectacular job as usual.
Not only a leading light, but a leading sound.
Thank you.
Bingo.
All right, guys. See you later.
Yeah. Everybody take care.
Thank you very much, John. Good night.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.